יבנה ביתו בקרוב, אז יראו, יבנה ביתו בקרוב, במהרה ימינו בקרוב, במהרה ימינו בקרוב. כל בני ביתך בקרוב, כל בני ביתך בקרוב. אחד מי יודע, אחד אני יודע, אחד אלוקינו שבשמיים ובארץ. Who knows two? We know two. Two are the tablets that Moshe brought, and one is Hashem. In heaven.
Good evening, my holy brothers and sisters. How are you? That was the Maccabees doing a medley of Passover songs. Why are we playing them now? We're in the 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av, which is this Sunday. This is a time when it's actually prohibited to listen to instrumental music, but a cappella music is okay. And it's actually very appropriate because as we prepare for this saddest day in the calendar, and we're thinking about what caused the Second Temple to be destroyed, baseless hatred among ourselves, when we gather, when we learn together, when we sing together, we're already starting to do that rectification. In fact, the sages have a teaching that every generation where we don't cure baseless hatred among ourselves, so then we participate in the transgression and the sin that led to the destruction of the Second Temple. So when we empathize, when we sympathize, when we gather, when we care about each other, we're helping to rectify that transgression. Let's light up the darkness. I'm going to have another word to say about these 9 days momentarily, but let's see who is with us as we do some beautiful learning together on a Tuesday night. James in Indianapolis, Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, Deborah in Kern County, Stephen in New Hampshire, John in Sedona, John in Lewiston, Guy in Dayton, Ohio, Allison in California, Yehuda in South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Pauline in Arkansas, Christo says, perfect timing, just finished some tech study with my chavura on FaceTime. Lucy in Minnesota, Jose in Miami Lakes, Florida, Shannon in Virginia, Rochelle in Modesto, Carol in Cleveland, Bill in Missouri, Sue loves the music, Paula here, Gwen from Michigan, Moishe is with us. Paula says, beautiful. Renee in Indiana, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, PK in Colorado, and over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, Lynn in North Texas, Iofe Isla Mays, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong and I apologize, in Ocala, Florida, and Gigi in British Columbia. We have a very somewhat cryptic but beautiful dedication today. Michelle Ravenel is dedicating today's learning to one lost light. She didn't explain what it means. We're not sure what it means. But like great poetry, it invites thinking about what it means. And just like at Passover, we always talk about the four children, the wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, the one that does not even know how to ask. But the real tragedy is the fifth child who is not present, who doesn't even know the Seder is happening. There are so many Jews, first of all, that don't even know they're Jews. There's the lost tribes of Israel. And when they were lost, when the northern kingdom fell and they went out into exile, and ever since then, these thousands of years since, there are people who don't even know that they're Jewish. Sometimes they discover it. Sometimes they're drawn back to the teachings, as it were. And there are many Jews who are just, shown some kind of uninspiring, boring version of Judaism, and they turned their back on it and walked away. almost like they had one bad taste of supermarket sushi and said sushi stinks. And that's just so sad. So perhaps Michelle's dedication is to all those lost souls who, could be benefiting and who would enjoy these teachings and don't even know what it is that they're missing. May they stumble into a teacher, a program, a group, a service, a rabbi, something that will reconnect them and show them the beauty of this tradition. And Michelle, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we thank you for dedicating today's class and enabling us to reach more people with this wisdom. Before we get into today's daf, again on this idea that during the 9 days, we think about, what it is that we could do to help rectify this baseless hatred that exists among ourselves and which has existed among ourselves for so long and which led to, according to our sages, the destruction of the Second Temple. So Rabbi Avraham Twersky says, looking at there's a law in Tractate Bava Kama of the Talmud that if one kindles a flame and another adds wood, and the flame spreads and destroys property, this is, when you think about what's going on in the California wildfires, here usually just one stupid person tosses a cigarette or a match, starts a fire. But what if that fire was going to go out by itself, but somebody added fuel to it? So then the one who added fuel is really the one to blame. If one kindles a flame and another adds wood, and the flame spreads and destroys property, the one who added the wood is liable for the damage, because without fuel, the flame would have been extinguished. What is the philosophical, moral, spiritual teaching in this law? Says Rabbi Twersky, when adults intervene to separate children who are fighting, it is customary to hear the youngsters shout, "He started it." No, he started it. When as grown-ups, we observe other grown-ups fight or see nations at war, we often hear the same juvenile claim, "He started it." The argument is often about who was the instigator, as though it were a very valid conclusion that the instigator is always at fault and that's the end of it. The law of the Talmud regarding a damage by fire has an important moral implication. The instigator is not necessarily always liable. The responsibility for the damage lies with whoever provided the fuel that enabled that fire to spread. King Solomon said, "A soft answer turns away wrath." Before we indict someone for his anger, we should examine our own role in both provoking and or fanning the flame. If we're not adding to the peace, if we're not adding to the solution, we might just be part of the problem. We might just be the problem. Something to think about. Okay, today's daf is daf Vav, page 6 here in the 7th volume of the Talmud, Tractate Sukkah. These are the laws of Sukkot, the fall festival. We're in chapter 1 of 5 here in this tractate, and the first chapter is all about defining what is a sukkah. And we've been talking about the dimensions of the sukkah. We've already mentioned that it has a maximum height up to the roofing of 20 cubits and a minimum height of 10 handbreadths. How do we know this? So yesterday we spent quite a bit of time talking about how the sages derived the law of the 10 handbreadths, that minimum height, because that's what separates one domain from another in the very spiritual teaching that God does not descend below 10 handbreadths above earth, right? And people from earth, living human beings, do not ascend past 10 handbreadths out of this realm. Obviously, we fly through the air, we even go into space. And yet we are, rooted in this world, and we can't understand the heavenly realm, until we leave this world, till we shuffle off the mortal coil, as Shakespeare might say. But I think it was Michael commented yesterday, it seems like the sages are stretching to make that point. Sometimes we feel like the way that they're deriving these numbers, these values, these technical details from verses that aren't really talking about technical details at all, it's like, are the rabbis stretching a little bit just because they need a dimension and they're finding it? Are they really like, they want the dimension to be this number and then they're looking for support in scripture, and when they find something that's roughly, going to back them up, they say, that's it, that's the proof? That would be a real skeptical way to approach what the rabbis are doing. And now the rabbis themselves are going to address this question. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the sages learned the minimum height of a sukkah as a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. Right? So there were certain laws that are not written out on the Torah, but they were the kind of initial core of the oral tradition. For example, one of the two examples that are most often given are matzah, right? Like, what is matzah? How do you define matzah? How do you know that what you're eating is matzah and that it had to be baked in less than 18 minutes, etc.? Matzah, it says unleavened bread, you shall remove leaven, but what matzah is not defined in the Torah. Moreover, tefillin, right? The commandment is you shall bind these words, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your resources, etc. You shall bind these words as a sign upon your hand. They shall be a symbol before your eyes. That's what the Torah says. The fact that becomes a black leather box with the scripture inside, the leather strap that you wrap around your arm, the other leather straps that go over around your head and around your neck, that Jewish men are obligated to put on every day, tefillin, that's not defined in the Torah at all. How do we know what tefillin are, what they look like? That was a law given to Moses by God at Mount Sinai. And God very purposefully initiated the oral tradition with these laws. The sages would add many decrees, explanations, stories, legends, philosophy, etc. And the oral tradition grew and grew and grew. But certain laws were given by God to Moses orally at Mount Sinai. So says Rabbi Yehuda that a bunch of these measurements, which we might find support for them in Scripture, but the actual way that we measure these things was told by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. As Rabbi Chia bar Ashi said, that Rav said, the measures in various areas of halacha, Jewish law, for example, an olive bulk, a dried fig bulk, an egg bulk, and the various laws of interpositions that serve as a barrier between one's body and the water in a mikvah, in a ritual bath, and which would invalidate an immersion, and the dimensions and nature of partitions like the walls of a sukkah, the height of a sukkah, are all halachas, laws, transmitted to Moses from Sinai, right, at Mount Sinai. They were not written in the Torah, rather they were received in the framework of the oral law. The Gemara questions this assertion. Are measures a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai? But they are written in the Torah, as it is written in Deuteronomy 8:8, a land, meaning the Holy Land, it's a land of wheat and barley and vines and figs and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. Did you hear all the measurements that were given there, detailed in the Torah? These are the 7 species, right, for which the Holy Land is characterized as a land of plenty, a beautiful land, a land of milk and honey, characterized by these 7 species. How are these measurements? How can these be said to be measurements? And Rav Chanin said the entire verse is stated for the purpose of teaching measures with regard to different halachas in the Torah. And now he explains what he means. Wheat was mentioned as the basis for calculating the time required for one to become ritually impure when entering a house afflicted with leprosy. Right, so we've seen that tzara'as, this physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, which could erupt as skin lesions. It's called leprosy. It's often translated as leprosy, but it's not. It's not this disease, the medical disease leprosy. It's this other condition when there's eruptions on the skin. They're very particular, and we don't have this anymore. This only existed when the whole nation was at a higher level, when the temple was in our midst. But there were also related eruptions, not just on a person, but on the walls of a house. And if you entered a house that had tzara'as, so then you would become tameh, ritually impure, and you'd have to go through a purification process. What does that have to do with wheat? So if you enter a house that has tzara'as, you become impure. Depending on how long you're in that house, your garments and other things on your person, ornaments on your person, will also become impure. As we learned in a Mishnah, with regard to one who enters a house afflicted with tzara'as of the house, and his clothes are draped over his shoulders, and his sandals and rings are in his hands, both he and they, the clothes, the sandals, the rings, immediately become tameh, ritually impure. But if he was dressed in his clothes, and his sandals were on his feet, and his rings were on his fingers, so he immediately becomes tameh, but they, the clothes, the sandals, and the rings, remain pure until he stays in the house long enough to eat half a loaf of bread. And this calculation is based on the fact that wheat bread takes less time to eat rather than barley bread, which takes longer. And it relates to one who is reclining and eating together with a relish or a condiment, which hastens the eating. This is a Torah measurement connected specifically to wheat. You might have thought that, okay, how long does it take for your clothes to become impure in that house? Is it a matter of seconds, a matter of minutes, a matter of hours? No, it's the amount of time it takes to eat half a loaf of wheat bread. Barley is also used as a basis for measurements. As we learned in a Mishnah, a bone from a corpse, the size of a grain of barley, imparts ritual impurity through contact and by being carried, but it does not impart impurity by means of a tent. I.e., if the bone was inside a house, it does not render all the other articles in that house ritually impure. But for the sake of contact, if you come into contact not with an entire human corpse, but just a tiny bit of a corpse, you're going to become impure unless the little bit of the human corpse that you touched is smaller than the size of a barley grain. The halachic measure determined by a vine, the grapevine, is the quantity of a quarter lug of wine for a Nazir, the Nazirite, the one who vows not to partake of wine or any grape products, nor to cut his hair, like Samson, the biblical character. A Nazir for whom it is prohibited to drink wine is liable to be flogged for violating his vow if he drinks that measure, right? So from wine, we get this measure. Why is it a quarter log? That's another question. But the amount for which he violates his oath is based on an amount of wine. The fig. The fig alludes to the measure of a dried fig bolt. A dried fig bulk, right? The volume of a dried fig. With regard to the laws of carrying on Shabbos. One is liable for carrying food that's fit for human consumption on Shabbos in the public domain, more than 4 cubits. If he carries this amount of food, he has violated Shabbos. But if he carries less than the volume of a fig, then he hasn't done anything at all. Pomegranate. What do we learn from the volume of a pomegranate that has to do with dimensions? It teaches the following measure. As we learned in a Mishnah, all ritually impure wooden vessels belonging to ordinary homeowners become pure through being broken. If you break it, it's no longer a vessel, and you can use its parts for some other construction project and not worry that they are impure. The wooden vessel somehow became impure, and a wooden vessel cannot be purified in fire or in water like a clay vessel cannot be purified, but metal and glass could be. But the wooden vessel, if you destroy it, then you could use the wood for something else and not worry that it became impure. And so at what point is it considered destroyed? if it's a wooden bowl, for example, when it has holes in the bowl the size of a pomegranate, okay, so it's no longer a wooden bowl that could be used for anything. So it's been technically destroyed, and now it's no longer considered impure if it had come into contact with a source of impurity. And the sages interpreted a land of olive oil and honey. What are the measurements that we derive from olive oil and honey? A land, all of whose measures are olive bulks. Olive bulks meaning the bulk of an olive, right? That's why olive oil was mentioned in that verse. And the Gemara poses a question. Does it enter your mind that it is a land, all of whose measures are olive bulks? But aren't there those measures that we just mentioned above, which are not the size of an olive? We talked about a pomegranate. We talked about a grain of barley. We talked about the quarter lug of wine. We talked about, time related to eating half a loaf of bread. What do you mean all its measures are olive bulks? Rather, say, a land, most of whose measures are olive bulks. For indeed, the size of an olive is a minimum measure that comes up in many different laws, as most measures relating to forbidden foods. For example, the forbidden fats, that you're not allowed to eat the certain fats of a kosher animal. You can't eat the blood. If you leave the edible part of an offering over too long after the sacrifice, or you intend to leave it over at the time that you're sacrificing it. All of these are tied to the volume of an olive. Ritually impure food, and the sciatic nerve, which is a nerve that you're not allowed to eat for kosher meat. All of these, the minimum measures, are the volume of an olive, as are the measures for a corpse to transmit impurity in a tent, right? To touch a corpse, a barley corn, a bit of like a size of a barley grain is enough. But for a piece of a corpse to be indoors with you and to render all the people that are in that room impure, that's an olive bulk of human corpse. And an animal carcass to transmit impurity through contact. All of these are tied to the volume of an olive. What about honey? Where do we see a measure tied to honey? And here it's good to remember that when we talk about a land of milk and honey, we are not talking about honeycomb honey. We're not talking about honey manufactured by bees. When the Bible talks about honey as in a land of milk and honey, it is talking about the honey that comes from dates, from a date palm. Date honey. Honey, i.e. dates from which date honey is extracted, also determines a measure. As we saw recently, as with regard to eating on Yom Kippur, one is liable only if he eats the volume of a large date of food. So apparently all of these halachic measurements are derived from this verse in the Torah, and they are not halachas transmitted to Moses from Sinai. But the Gemara immediately rejects this argument. And how can you understand it in that manner? That all these measures are explicitly written in the Torah with regard to each of the halachas mentioned above? They might be, the foods that these measurements are tied to are mentioned in the Torah, but the Torah doesn't say that this land characterized by figs and olives and pomegranates and dates, etc., that these should be used for measurements. The fact that we do use them for measurements is a law that Moses received from God at Mount Sinai. And the verse that is cited is mere support for these laws, not the source of these laws. We skip down a little bit onto the B side of page 6. The halacha, the law transmitted to Moses from Sinai, that the minimum height for partitions, like the walls of a sukkah, is 10 handbreadths, is as we stated earlier. And the Gemara asks, this works out well according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that there is no verse in the Torah from which this halakha, this law, can be derived, as he therefore concludes that it is a law transmitted to Moses from Sinai. However, according to Rabbi Meir, who holds that all of the cubits in the temple consist of 6 handbreadths, and therefore the measure of 10 handbreadths can be derived from verses in the Torah, What is there to say? What is the law transmitted to Moses from Sinai with regard to partitions, right? According to Rabbi Yehuda, okay, we know that it's 10 handbreadths high because God told Moses at Sinai that that's the minimum measure for a partition. But according to Rabbi Meir, who says, no, the reason that it's 10 handbreadths high is, as we said yesterday, because that's the height of the Ark of the Covenant. It's a cubit and a half, that's 9 handbreadths, plus the handbreadth of the ark cover is 10 handbreadths. We went through a whole derivation of that yesterday. So according to Rabbi Meir, the 10 handbreadths of a partition is derived from the Torah. So according to Rabbi Meir, what did God teach Moses at Mount Sinai? When the halacha transmitted to Moses comes to teach, it is with regard to other laws concerning partitions, right? So what God told Moses at Sinai was not the 10 handbreadths height, but there's other laws relating to partitions. For example, the laws of extending, according to which an existing partition is extended upward or downward to complete the requisite measure. So there are times where the sages will say, well, this wall wasn't complete, but because it's clearly a vertical demarcation and everyone understands that it acts as a border, so even though it doesn't reach the ceiling, we're going to project hypothetically like it did extend, and then we can make rulings based on that. And this principle of extending is something that Moses learned from God at Mount Sinai, according to this interpretation of Rabbi Meir's holding. And also, there's the laws of joining, where if one wall comes within 3 handbreadths of another wall, it's as if it reached that wall and there is no gap between them. Similar to walls extending up and down, but here we're talking about sort of horizontal extension. And then there's the laws of a curved wall of a sukkah, which teaches, and we'll see this later, that a sukkah is fit even if there are up to 4 cubits of unfit roofing, provided that this roofing is adjacent to one of the walls of the sukkah. In that case, the unfit roofing is considered a bent extension of the wall, right? So it's like the wall kind of curved in, and then where the real roofing begins, the legitimate roofing, the qualified roofing, the fit roofing, that's where the sukkah really is. And the fact that there's unfit roofing adjacent to the wall isn't going to render the entire sukkah unfit. That principle was a law taught to Moses at Sinai, according to this. Now, among the factors listed in the Mishna that render a sukkah unfit is, and one that does not have 3 walls. So now we're going back to our Mishnah that we've been discussing, the first Mishnah of chapter 1. And one requirement of a sukkah is that it must have at least 3 walls. And as we'll see, it's going to be discussed again later, it has to have 3 walls, and really what that means is 2 complete walls, and the 3rd wall only needs to be a handbreadth. Now, most of us think of a building, as something that has 4 sides, and it actually does have 4 sides, but it only needs 3 walls. Why? Because one side can be open. Right? One side can be it's acting as a door. And many sukkahs are built that way. It's really just 3-sided, and the 4th side is completely open, and that is a completely legitimate sukkah. But in fact, that the 3rd side doesn't have to be complete either. It's just kind of enough to sort of define where the corners would end up, and then we kind of project that 4th corner where it would end up. So according to our Mishnah, a sukkah must have 3 walls. The idea that one of the walls only has to be a handbreadth thick, we're not up to that yet, but we're coming soon. But our Mishnah says a sukkah must have 3 walls. Now that is the law. The sages taught in the Tosefta, in order to construct a fit sukkah, 2 of the walls must be walls in the standard sense, sealing the entire length and height of the sukkah. And the 3rd wall may even be 1 handbreadth wide. And Rabbi Shimon says 3 of the walls must be walls in the standard sense, and the 4th wall may even just be 1 handbreadth wide. And the Gemara asks, with regard to what principle do they disagree? The sages say all you need is 3 walls, one of which can be very short. or very narrow. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, you need 4 walls. The 4th wall can be, barely there, but only 1 handbreadth wide. So with regard to what principle do they disagree, the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon? The rabbis hold the tradition of the manner in which the verses in the Torah are written is authoritative. And one derives laws based on the spelling of the words. And Rabbi Shimon holds the vocalization of the Torah is authoritative, meaning that one derives laws based on the pronunciation of the words, although it diverges from the spelling. Now, in English, this hardly makes sense to us because when we see English written out, it's like, okay, it's written. There's very few words in English that have multiple pronunciations for the exact same spelling. I guess the word read is sometimes pronounced read in the past tense, but mostly the way words are spelled, tells you how they're going to be pronounced. But the way that the Torah is written is basically with consonants. The vowels are implied. Right? And because the vowels are implied, sometimes the same word, the same spelling could be pronounced completely different, right? Where you would insert different you do it with different vowels implied, and then it has a different meaning altogether. And so what is going to be dispositive? Is there the primary way that the written word tells us it's meant to be teaching? Or is the way that we have a tradition which says the way it's supposed to be pronounced, is that going to be authoritative? Rabbi Shimon says what the tradition has led to telling us is how to pronounce it. That's the authoritative version of the Torah. And the rabbis say what's written is authoritative. And while there are some words that could be pronounced differently and change the meaning of the verse, when we're deriving laws, we're going to go primary with what's written there and the primary meaning, what we would think it means, based on the way it's written. With regard to the Sukkah, the rabbis hold the tradition of the verses is authoritative, as the word basukot is written, in the Sukkah, is written 3 times in the context of the mitzvah, the commandment of Sukkah. It is written twice in the verse, Leviticus 23:42, Basukot, in Sukkahs shall you reside 7 days. All that are homeborn in Israel shall reside Basukot, in Sukkahs. Right? So it's repeated twice in that same verse. In both of these instances, the word in Hebrew is spelled without a vav. Right? So the vav is one of those words, one of those letters that sometimes functions as a consonant and sometimes functions as a vowel. Most of the vowels are actually like little symbols beneath the words. That was kind of developed later. And Hebrew is mostly, when it's written and traditionally, like in Torah scrolls, only the consonants. But the vav is actually kind of a flexible letter. And sometimes it's there when being used as a vowel, and sometimes it's omitted and it is implied that it is there. Why does that matter? Because in this situation, in that Leviticus 23:42, in both of those instances, the word in Hebrew is spelled without a vav, as are Hebrew words in the singular when it's this kind of construction in the grammar. And one time it is written with a vav, as are Hebrew words in the plural. And that's Leviticus 23:43, the next verse. So that your future generations will know that I caused the children of Israel to reside basukot, in sukkahs, right? Some people might say that there's a place called Sukkot, and so I caused the children of Israel to reside in that place. But we're not even going to that interpretation right now. Right now we're just talking about the difference between that all people should reside in a sukkah, like their sukkah, or all the people should know that I command the people to reside in sukkahs, right? Plural. Why does it matter? Because the fact that the word is used more often than really was necessary for this verse to explain what it's trying to explain in the Torah, anytime there's an extra word, the sages say that, well, it was included for a reason, and it must be to teach us something. So the first mention of in sukkahs is to say, I want the children of Israel to dwell in sukkahs at this time of year for all their generations. Why is it mentioned 2 more times? To teach a law. What is that law? About the walls of the sukkah. Now, it's mentioned 2 more times. Are those singular uses? Is it actually a singular use, or is it a plural use? If both of them are plural, it's like there's 4 extra uses. If one is plural and one is singular, then there's 3 extra. This is what they're going to be arguing about. So subtract 1 to teach the mitzvah, the commandment of the sukkah itself, and 3 remain. These 3 remaining sukkahs teach that the sukkah requires 3 walls. Two of the three are the walls in the standard sense, and the law transmitted to Moses from Sinai comes and reduces the dimension of the third and establishes it as 1 handbreadth. That's what Moses heard at Mount Sinai, that it only needs to be 1 handbreadth wide, the final wall. That's okay according to a law that Moses received at Sinai. But the verses in the Torah tell us how many walls are required. The tradition teaches from Moses that the 1 wall need not be any longer than 1 handbreadth, but the verses teach you need 3 walls total. On the other hand, Rabbi Shimon holds that the vocalization of the Torah is authoritative. Therefore, although 2 of the instances are written without a vav, since they are all vocalized in the plural manner, basukot, 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 the 3 words are pronounced the same even though they're not written the same, there is mention here of the sukkah 6 times, 3 words, each of which is plural, so it's 6 mentions. So subtract 1 verse to teach the commandment of dwelling in a sukkah itself, and 2 mentions of these plural words remain, which equal 4 sukkot, and they teach that the sukkah requires 4 walls, according to Rabbi Shimon. 3 of the walls are walls in the standard sense, and the law that was transmitted to Moses from Sinai comes and reduces the dimension of the 4th wall to just 1 handbreadth. That's all that is necessary. So that's why Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis disagree. The rabbis say you need 3 walls. Rabbi Shimon says you need 4 walls. The halacha, the law, was fixed according to the opinion of the majority, the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon. And if you wish, say, so here's another way to derive this, say instead that everyone agrees that the vocalization of the Torah is authoritative, and here it is with regard to this that they disagree. One sage, meaning the rabbis, the majority, holds that to derive its roofing requires a verse. Therefore, only 3 of the original 6 sukkahs remain from which walls can be derived. And the law transmitted to Moses from Sinai reduces the dimension of 1 of the 3 walls to 1 handbreadth. And the other sage, Rabbi Shimon, holds that to derive something about its roofing does not require a verse, as the essence of a sukkah is its roofing. See, that's why the walls are really not that important. We're going to need some minimum measure of walls to hold up the roofing and to provide a little bit of shelter sideways, but the essence of a sukkah is the roof, right? Recalling the clouds of glory that kept the sun from baking us when the children of Israel lived in the wilderness for 40 years, it is the roofing that is the essence of the sukkah. You have to be able to see through it, but it has to provide more shade than light. And if you wish, and I'm almost done, so if you've got questions or comments, get them in. And if you wish, say instead that everyone agrees that the tradition of the verses is authoritative, the written Torah is authoritative, and here it is with regard to this that they disagree. On one side of the argument, the rabbis hold when the halacha transmitted to Moses comes to teach, it is to reduce to 1 handbreadth the dimension of 1 of the 3 walls derived from the verses. And the other side of the argument, Rabbi Shimon holds, when the halacha transmitted to Moses at Sinai comes to teach, it is to add another wall to the 3 walls derived from the verses. However, the dimension of the 4th wall may be 1 handbreadth. Or another way to look at the argument, and if you wish, say instead that everyone agrees that when the law transmitted to Moses at Sinai comes to teach, it is to reduce the dimension of 1 of the 3 walls, and everyone agrees that the tradition of the verses, the written verses, is authoritative, and there are 4 mentions of sukkah in the verse, and here it is with regard to whether one derives numbers of legal matters from the first mention of a term in the Torah that they disagree. When the total is derived from the number of instances that a certain word appears in a Torah, there is a dispute whether the first time it appears is included in the tally, or whether the first instance is necessary to teach the mitzvah itself, and the number may be counted only from subsequent, seemingly extraneous mentions of the same word. One sage, Rabbi Shimon, holds that one derives numbers from the first mention, and therefore 4 walls are included in the verses. And the other sage, the rabbis, hold that one does not derive numbers, numerical laws, from the first mention of a word, since that was used to teach its own law, and it's the additional uses of that word which are seemingly extraneous from which we learn a numerical value in the law, like you need 3 walls in a sukkah. Rav Matana said the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Shimon is actually derived from a totally different idea. He said it's derived from here, in Isaiah 4:6, and there shall be a sukkah for shade in the daytime from the heat, and for refuge and cover from storm and from rain. And a sukkah without 3 full-fledged walls does not provide shelter nor serve as a refuge. And that's where they leave the argument. Tomorrow we will continue discussing about this idea that 1 wall only needs to be 1 handbreadth. But in terms of the number of walls, that's where they let it sit. And the law was fixed according to the majority that a sukkah actually only needs 3 walls. The 3rd wall can be short or it can be complete, but you only need 3 walls for a legit sukkah. Okay, let's see about comments and questions. Okay, Christo. So when the temple is rebuilt and functioning again, is it possible that Sara'as could also return as well? I hope not, because Sara'as sounds like much tsuris. Very good. I'm not sure if those words are from the same root or not, but the idea, tsuris is like aggravation, right? So Sara'as certainly sounds aggravating, right? And our sages learn out about that condition, right? That biblical leprosy, which was like these skin eruptions. And when you have it, you have to remove yourself from the community, tell people that you are contaminated. You have to go into quarantine. And then after you go through your time of quarantine and purification, then once you complete your purification, you can rejoin the community. But our sages derive that what caused Tzara'as was Lashon Hara, evil speech, wicked tongue, speaking slander and gossip, and using the gift of speech in an inappropriate manner about other people. Maybe the reason that Sara'as is gone now is because we would all have it all the time, right? So the idea is that when the 3rd temple is rebuilt and we enter the Messianic age, so there's going to be all kinds of laws, like the laws of sacrifices, that we're not able to observe now, that we should be able to observe when the 3rd temple is rebuilt. So what that would mean is that the whole nation and the whole world is going to be at a much higher spiritual level. At that heightened level, perhaps Tzara'as will return, but it's sort of like you want to live in a nation of laws, right? Like you wouldn't want to live in a lawless place. So this is a kind of check and balance where it's going to keep us using our gift of speech in the right way. If Tzara'as came back, most of us would not have Tzara'as most of the time. Maybe never, if we'd be living in such a heightened state where the awareness of God would fill the world the way water fills the sea. And when we're all able to perceive what beautiful spiritual creatures we all are, we wouldn't be gossiping and slandering each other. And so Tzara'as, while it would be available to happen, would rarely happen, we would hope. So I'm not sure. I haven't looked this up recently, whether the sages believe that Tzara'as will return along with the 3rd temple. But I wouldn't be surprised if it would, and I don't think we'd have to worry about it too much. But it's a good question. Yosef, just a general question about the Talmud and its structure. So far I've noticed that topics tend to run into each other from the end of one tractate to the beginning of another. Is that how the rest of the Talmud is? To some extent, but then you also see that the rabbis will go into a digression, like at a moment's notice, right? At any time, you never know. That's what's so beautiful about reading the whole Talmud the way we're reading it, every single page, just in the order that it's printed. you never know what you're going to find. You could be discussing, the laws of minimum measurements, and suddenly yesterday we were in this beautiful mystical discussion about the connection between heaven and earth. But we certainly did see what you're saying, that certain laws from Shabbos extended into Eruvin. And here we see some discussion that was at the end of Yom Kippur, appearing again now at the beginning of Sukkah. And we were talking about the Sukkah toward the end of Yom Kippur. So there is some of that. I don't know to what extent it was purposeful. It's just that the rabbis, the sages were geniuses, like absolute geniuses. The minimum that any sort of, Torah, like the average teenager back then, and not even so long ago, had the whole Bible memorized, right? All of Scripture, the entire Hebrew Bible memorized. So when the whole thing is memorized, so you can easily see connections between verse in one place, a verse in another, because it's like all in your mind, right? Like the whole thing is hyperlinked to itself. And sages had the whole Mishna memorized as well, and the whole Gemara memorized. They had the whole Talmud memorized, right? And so that's why they could so easily bounce around and draw ideas from one area to another, and they only needed to hint at what they were talking about for everyone else to understand them. We're at a much lower level. We need printed books. We need 73 volumes worth of footnotes of the stuff so we can understand it better. But that's why they're so, facile. It's so easy for them. They're so supple with the words of Scripture and the oral tradition, because they had it all memorized. And for them, sort of what seems like playing games to us and like where are they pulling this from, it made perfect sense for them. David Whiteley. Hold on a second. David Whiteley asks, is the syntax lost conversationally versus what is written, masculine versus feminine, and what is the modern text? Right? So, first of all, in terms of the Bible and certainly the Talmud, it's so terse. Right? It's so terse. Like all of these laws are hinted at. God says, you shall do this, you shall not do that. But it's almost, like if you look at the U.S. code, right? The law of America, or the law of a state, defining when do you get a speeding ticket. It doesn't just say, if you go more than 55 miles an hour, you get a ticket. The law is just, volumes of what you're speeding, how you're speeding, what vehicle you're speeding, and what kind of a road you're speeding, and was the speed limit posted? Are you near a school zone? Was there sidewalk? Is it a 2-lane road, a 4-lane road, blacktop, dirt? And because all these situations have come up and require definition. And likewise, that's why the sages expounded all these laws, because in the real world, to know whether a law applies or not, there's so many different cases, and they had to figure it out. But the Bible is very terse, and in its terseness is where there's the possibility of multiple meanings and interpretations. On top of that, Hebrew is a moody language with far fewer words than modern languages have, and lots of multiple meanings for the same word. And the way Hebrew is constructed, is like one word, depending on what prefixes and suffixes you add to it, includes the preposition and the article in the. That in the book, which is for us is 3 words, that would be just one word with prefixes added. And so there's all these possibilities. And I just wish that my Hebrew was like a lot better. I study a lot, I pray a lot. I study Hebrew to some extent. I can't even say that I speak Hebrew. But at least I've studied enough that I really appreciate these multivalent and nuanced meanings in the language. And for anyone who's got the time and energy, take classes, learn Hebrew. It's a phenomenal language. And our sages hold that the basic building block of reality is not atoms or molecules or protons or Higgs bosons. It is the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There's much discussion about date honey. It's called Ceylon, and everybody wants to try it. Bill is planning to order some and report back. Awesome. I look forward to hearing that. I should get some date honey. And finally, Carolyn, are the 3 walls literal, or could they represent a spiritual foundation of sorts? I mean, the 3 walls are literal when we're talking about, is it a fit sukkah or not? What meanings can we derive from the fact that 3 walls are necessary? More to come on that question. For sure, there's spiritual meanings that we can take from it, but a sukkah has to have 3 walls, right? And that comes up in very interesting situations. Like if you have a freestanding sukkah, generally speaking, it's going to be a 4-sided sukkah. Maybe you'll leave one whole side open and that'll be fine. But where it gets interesting is sometimes people have a pergola that extends away from their house. So these are the beams, and they could put the roofing material over that. And that can be a legitimate sukkah. But do they have the 3 walls? Do they have to extend one of their walls? Is there something wrong with the fixed walls? And then that's where you actually, if you're going to try to build a sukkah in that manner, you might need to have a rabbi who's expert in the laws of sukkahs come to your house to determine whether your sukkah is fit or not. These are complex laws. But in terms of spiritual meanings, stay tuned. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 7 of Tractate Sukkah at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And don't forget this Sunday, Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Hebrew calendar, also a day to cry out. There's a lot of tsuris in the world right now, a lot of pain, a lot of aggravation, a lot of difficulty, a lot of things not going the way they should be. If you think the world needs a lot of help from God, join us in crying out to God. When we cried out when we were slaves in Egypt, God redeemed us. When we cried out when the Jewish people were threatened with annihilation in the book of Esther, God heard our cries and we were saved. If we all cry out about the state of the world, things will get better. So join us in crying out this Sunday. It's easy. All you have to do is say, "Help us, God." And then you've joined us in the day to cry out, a day to cry out. All the best.